And we are live.
Aloha snack bar, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever the heck in the world you are. It's the one, the only, the majestic ape, Senor Silverback himself, the monetary monkey, and he is back with not only CJ, the master of the flux capacitor, but we have our special guest with us today for a special treat. It's London Paul and James, the Russian analyst. I think the planets have aligned, CJ. I think the Mercury is in retrograde, and the star of Sirius has aligned with the Bear constellation somewhere in the Palladian. You know. Anyway,
Amen, V. Amen.
I haven't slept much. Thank God these two guys are here. Guys,
Absolutely.
welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Well,
Hello?
did I just log off? Am I live?
No.
Yeah.
No, we can hear you.
We're
I
live.
can hear you well.
We can hear you. You may want to reconnect if you can't hear us. So, yeah, good morning, everyone. And we are absolutely delighted today to be joined by London Paul and James, the Russian analyst. V, if you can hear me,
Yes.
we can hear you fine now.
Okay, good.
Okay, go for it.
All right. So, I mean, there's a lot of things going down, gentlemen. I mean, where do you guys want to begin? I mean, there's a lot of talk of 4D and 5D chess. There's things that are happening, and there's a lot of wishful thinking and people saying that we just don't understand and we need to wait and, this, that, and the other. What say you, Paul? Let's start with you, then we'll go to James.
Yeah, I think, I kind of got in touch with you guys this morning thinking it was worth talking about North Korea.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, historically, there's been a lot of hot air coming out of North Korea about threatening to do, this, that, and the other for a number of years. And I don't want to sound alarmist because I'm not an alarmist kind of person, but I think we start to have to look at North Korea from a slightly different perspective. Now, for anyone who's not aware, because we have spoken about this before, North Korea isn't what people think. North Korea was a CIA vassal state and remains that way. It's not some kind of rogue nation that's just operating all by itself. It actually has quite a lot of US military technology as well.
Oh, wow.
And up-to-date stuff, not kind of stuff from the 1980s or something. So that,
Or the 60s.
That's
Yeah,
just-
that's news to
yeah.
me, London Paul. And
Yeah.
probably most of this audience.
yeah, so that is a big problem. Now, obviously, we have to kind of put it in context what's going on. Now, obviously, it's the holiday weekend, for us, but also North Korea celebrates the 105th anniversary of its founder, Kim Il-sung, I think his name. Now, normally, we have street parties and things like that, but not in North Korea, no. They like to carry out ballistic missile launches on these weekends and typically have done in the past. Or the risk is they're now kind of rumbling and talking about conducting a nuclear test, for example. Now, the issue there comes in is, okay, we've also got the US kind of steamrolling towards, the Korean Peninsula. Now, the US has said, look, we're not interested in having a preemptive strike. I actually think that's true. And Tillerson the other day was kind of backing off saying, well, the fleet's going over. It's just normal routine maneuvers in the Pacific. Don't get too worked up about it. The problem is, and this is my concern, is the North Koreans could launch a missile. It may be, as they've done in years gone by, the US sees that as some kind of provocation and then launches what would amount to not a preemptive strike, but pretty much. Now, if they do, all hell breaks loose as a result of that. Now, we could say, well, this is all very speculative, but what we do know, and it has been confirmed, North Korea has ordered the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of residents from the capital.
Oh, wow.
And the Russians apparently have confirmed this. The Chinese are making noises at the moment. They're concerned about the threat of war as well.
We've seen footage on Twitter that's not confirmed of Chinese air defense systems, mobile air defense systems and equipment being moved up to their border in the Shenyang district. I'm not exactly sure where that is. I think it's northeastern, closer to the Yellow Sea.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there was a lot of concern about the build-up of soldiers on the North Korean border. It's nowhere near. It's not 150,000 or anything like that. And a lot of this, it's not a question of China's going to suddenly say, right, we're just going to invade North Korea. It's a preemptive move in case there's suddenly mass evacuation of people trying to get out of North Korea and cross the border. It's more to do with that. China wouldn't, in no way, shape, or form, is going to get dragged into a ground war, because they will never win it with North Korea. I mean, for me, I said to CJ before we came on, and it'd be like Vietnam on steroids for China to go into that. It will be absolute insanity, because people shouldn't underestimate North Korea has got a will fight to the death, and they, as a nation, and they will never win a war there. It would be absolutely pointless, and also it'd be very damaging for China to do so.
Well, just as a reminder for our audience, London Paul, I believe 37,000 Americans died in the Korean War. I don't know what the casualties were among the Commonwealth troops who were with it. I know Britain and Australia, and I'm not sure if New Zealand also fought in the Korea campaign. I think Canadians were there too.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Oh yeah, it's so the question always comes about, and then we have to. I always like to take a step back from these situations and say, okay, let's focus. I mean, I don't want to dwell too much on what went on in Syria, because we've kind of talked that a lot. But when you stack up what went on in Syria, which was just a complete moment of insanity, then we factor in this kind of showboating in Afghanistan yesterday, where the US drops this something like 21,000-pound bomb in eastern Afghanistan. Now, the rationale for doing that is purely just to try and convince the world we're strong, we're dominant, don't mess with us, because there's no other reason. This idea, oh, we took out a bunch of ISIS people, is probably absolute rubbish.
Correct.
And therefore, you start to stack things up and go, well, there's a show of force in Syria. There's a show of force in Afghanistan. Now they're kind of, there's the fleet heading towards the Korean Peninsula. It kind of fits in with that ballpark. But the question I ask myself is, why now? Why now, not a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago? It suggests to me, and we've talked, lots of us have talked for years about the US kicking the can down the road economically. Well, I think they've run out of road. I don't think they've got anywhere to go. I mean, the debt ceiling issue's gone very, very quiet. We've heard nothing about it. Right. Where normally, in years gone by, okay, it turned out to be largely hot air, but the conversation never stopped. We've heard nothing. No one's talked about it. The issue is, if they can't, kick the can down the road anymore, then therefore then it suggests to me they can't raise the debt ceiling. Therefore, financially, it's game over. Well, what are they likely to do? The immediate thing that always happens, and we've seen this throughout history, is let's go to war. Let's have a war somewhere, or let's stoke the embers. Well, they certainly did it in Syria. It hasn't had the effect they thought it would have. The Afghanistan, well, it's not stoking a war there, but it's just trying to beat the drums a bit and say to the rest of the world, look, we're in charge, we're in control. And the reality is the US military is anything but that. The Russian military is so far ahead in every aspect, in land, in sea, in the air.
And in the air.
And even in outer space.
Yep.
They are so far ahead, and whatever the US administration would like to convince people. But I think the concern I would have is, the risk is that North Korea could launch something. Are they likely to launch a nuclear warhead at South Korea or something like that, or anywhere else for that matter, Japan or into China? I think it's unlikely. I wouldn't rule it out, but my fear is that the US may just see this as almost, it's like not a preemptive strike, but essentially it would be that North Korea might do something. If the US retaliates, then all hell will break loose. And that we can be absolutely certain. And the ramifications could be extremely serious, as anybody would know.
Well, London Paul, I haven't seen a whole lot of chatter yet about Russian military movements or preparations. I did see some indications that the Far Eastern Military District has gone on alert. Now, what that entails exactly, I'm not certain. I would assume that means that the air defense systems, the regions of the Far East, Vladivostok and the Kamchatka Peninsula, are on heavy alert. Now, Russia itself doesn't have much of a border with North Korea. I think it's a very narrow strip of land up there by Nakhodka Bay. But Vladivostok is not far from the North Korean border in terms of the Russian Far Eastern Fleet and Pacific Naval Squadron. I believe that there's the flagship of the Russian Pacific Fleet is visiting South Korea at the moment, and we have President Vice President Mike Pence headed to South Korea, to Seoul. I presume part of the purpose of his trip is to kind of try to calm people down a little bit. Hostilities are imminent because you have these NBC News reports. And I wanted to say something about NBC News because they've been really a part of a lot of psyops or disinformation efforts. I know that Sibel Edmonds, whose work you're probably familiar with, she criticized NBC News sharply and a lot of the retired general consultants they had that they were paying because they put out disinformation during the July 2016 coup d'etat against Erdogan in Turkey, that they put out the disinfo that Erdogan had fled Turkish airspace in his plane and was trying to get asylum in Germany. So I just wanted to bring up that precedent of NBC News putting out disinfo, just so that people could put this reporting of theirs that the administration is plotting an imminent strike in context, and hopefully not overreact to it too much. Because I agree with you that the situation is getting very serious. I'm not sure that action is imminent yet. If you would have it doesn't seem likely that you would have a U.S. Vice President in Seoul for the fireworks to start, when the artillery barrages start coming in from across the DMZ. So
I absolutely agree with that. I think it's just, I don't think the US is going to launch a preemptive strike, but the concern is that does North Korea actually do something? Now, of course, we know historically there's been a lot of hot air year after year with the regime threatening, to launch a nuclear weapon and destroy whoever it might be, Japan, South Korea, China, or even claims of doing it to the US now. But this time, I think we have to be I'm not saying it's going to happen, but we have to be able to take it a little bit more seriously. Now, of course, it could just all be a big propaganda coup because, there's no doubt about it. The North Korean regime at some point is going to fall. It not necessarily is going to happen now. It could take a number of years. And at some point, from what I understand, it's been said to me for a long time that eventually North and South Korea will have unification again. Now, that's some way in the distance. So it could be that the North Korean regime is fearful that something may happen. So they're trying to put this show of strength up just to make everyone in North Korea feel like it's business as usual and there isn't a problem. There is a sense of rhetoric about this as well. But I think there is a general fear. The Chinese are normally pretty quiet. They don't say an awful lot, but they've been publicly coming out saying they're concerned about the threat of war. Now, they've never said that before, to my knowledge, in relation to North Korea. So we have to put it in context and not go, we're not NBC or anyone else for that matter. They have been kind of suggesting that was going to be a preemptive strike. A number of the typical mainstream media outlets. I don't see that happening from the US. Know what they did in Syria was insane, but I don't think that they're going to do something as ridiculous as just to launch a preemptive strike at North Korea, because they know the consequences are going to be catastrophic. So,
what's interesting here? What's interesting here, London Paul, is that we have to remember that one of the biggest roadblocks for an operation like this from ever occurring was President Park Geun-hye Lee. Okay, she's been removed. She's been deposed in basically a CIA coup, a la Dilma Rousseff style, where she's been removed from power. There are Koreans right now protesting even the fact that the U.S. anti-missile defense system, called the THAAD, which is an abject failure, by the way, is positioned in South Korea. It's interesting to see where this is going, because the war hawks that are in South Korea, the South Korean generals, are going along with whatever the U.S. wants. That is a bit worrisome, take. And there's really nobody within the Korean politic that's really standing up to this whole entire operation as of yet in any real strength,
Well, that's true. I think they've got the elections on the 9th of May in South Korea. And it's very likely whoever gets elected is going to take a very ironically of all that, is going to take a very anti-US stance and isn't interested in that. But you're absolutely right. At one point, the US have also kind of talked about, well, we might just put some nuclear warheads in South Korea. which would be absolutely insane way of provoking the North. So I don't think that's going to happen. It's very likely, though, that after the 9th, at some point, if the South Korean elections go the way some feel, then they're just going to tell the US to take that off their soil and actually stop meddling in the country. Now, how the CIA and others react to that is an entirely different matter. But yet, at the moment, there is this political vacuum.
Yeah.
In inverted commas in South Korea, which just adds to and stokes the problems.
Well, London Paul, I wanted to bring up, just kind of slightly interject here, as far as the not to change the subject back to Syria, because we are focused on the Korea situation.
No, please do.
But we cannot fail to mention the context of the Tomahawk strike and what it meant and what happened. And obviously, I'm still trying to sort through. I'm not saying that I know exactly what happened. To what extent the Russian electronic countermeasures actually brought down a number of Tomahawk missiles. It seems that...
What do you mean they brought down the Tomahawk missiles? Trump said every single one of them hit as he was eating chocolate cake.
Yeah,
and
and he was giving
we have the best in the world. We have the best in the world. Our technology is 5 times greater than anybody else. It was tremendous. Right. It was tremendous.
Yeah.
Well, actually, James, I can tell you, because we talked about this previously with V, that the Russians very successfully dealt with a lot of these Tomahawk missiles. And in fact, if they'd probably had more notice, they'd have been able to mobilize better and pretty much taken them all out. And I think that was a bit of a shock for the US. I mean, the US has had previous examples of the Russian technology being light years ahead. But I think they've had another example that you can rain 50, 60 Tomahawk missiles, and if we're prepared, we can pretty much neutralize every single one of them.
Well, I think the main point is, I don't know if they can neutralize all of them, but I do know that we don't have anything that can neutralize the calibers going the other way. That's the issue.
No. Well, yes, absolutely.
but regarding the main point, I think an article I read by Ruslan Ostashko at Polit Russia kind of summed up the Russians' attitude that, perhaps if the Americans get into a second Korean War, it would be a good thing for us Russians, because it would be such a military conflagration and a drain on their resources that maybe that will get them to back off us in Eastern Europe or in Syria. But I'm not so sure that's exactly a good analysis, because obviously there is a historical precedent for that type of Russian thinking. Stalin, who was not a Russian, he was a Georgian, Yosef Vissarionovich Dugashvili, thought the same thing about Hitler and Britain and France, that obviously, the Second World War would be like the First World War and all the Western powers would get bogged down. But of course, that's not what actually happened, because of a lot of the secret agreements and other things that went on for the rapid surrender of France. But in any case, are we, you alluded to it earlier in terms of this idea that what we're seeing is some kind of desperate war Keynesianism or attempt to militarize the U.S. economy, or at least just create a distraction, a monumental conflict that you can blame the financial crash on. But it just seems to me like the problem being that there's only so much focus and so much resources even within a superpower, and particularly when you're talking about the National Security Council and these groups in an administration. I'm not sure aren't they just kind of spreading themselves a bit thin on multiple fronts?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And also I think to do with the National Security Council seems to be getting the feedback there. It seems to be in complete disarray too. Currently, and the Trump administration.
I mean, that 4-pager they put out was particularly ridiculous. I mean, when you had Ted Postel, Theodore Postel, the professor at MIT, who, he worked with a woman who's been a guest on this program before, Mimi Al-Laham, Syria girl, to debunk this East Ghouta chemical attack false flag in 2013, which was pushed aggressively by Bellingcat, Elliot Higgins, who's a Leicester UK-based amateur hobbyist, former underwear salesman turned spokesman, great esteemed spokesman for all open source intelligence that the Atlantic Council or NATO deems fit to push forward. But he came out with a report of this pager that really just tore it to pieces in terms of not just the terms of the logic, of course, we know that one of the central premises of the document personally ordered this chemical attack because his soldiers were scared of losing ground to this Hama offensive is completely false. The chronology makes no sense. The Syrians had already defeated the North Hama offensive with Russian advisor and air support. There was literally no military logic to this, any type of this attack whatsoever. And yet, again, it does show you the sloppiness of this National Security Council, that they put together this document. And we don't, I mean, CIA Director Pompeo, who was not in the photograph that the White House released pertaining to the al-Sharat strike, came out, I think it was yesterday, when he gave the speech denouncing WikiLeaks, saying that CIA stood by all those conclusions. But nonetheless, it was a very haphazard, slopped together document.
Well, yeah, and the problem is, a few days before that, by all accounts, the CIA were advising Trump not to go and do what he did in Syria, which kind of shows that, as we know, that the CIA is deeply fragmented too, and there are factions of the CIA who are supportive of the action and those that aren't. So that just kind of completely muddies the waters too. But yeah,
and if I'm doing Kremlinology of the American government, which is kind of an ironic thing, when you think about the history of how people used to try to figure out who was up and who was down in the Soviet Union on the basis of who was standing next to Khrushchev or Brezhnev at the Lenin Day parade or May Day parade, you start to think that maybe when Pompeo comes out and gives that speech, what he's trying to do is essentially present this united front and avoid the idea that there is dissent within the agency.
Oh, I think undoubtedly his absence, or any CIA absence, the other day was hugely telling.
Yeah, I think it was Bob Perry, the former AP Iran-Contra reporter who writes for Consortium News, who was the one who noticed that Pompeo was not in the shot. And of course, in the infamous, largely hashed together or faked bin Laden killing, Zero Dark 30 raid photos that were released by the Obama White House, of course, Leon Panetta was very prominently featured. So yes. Director Pompeo's predecessor. So people noticed that. And I think that was probably one of the reasons Pompeo came out and gave that speech. But in terms of, this is something that Stephen Cohen, the respected professor at New York University, said the other day. I think it was on the Tucker Carlson program on Fox News. Oddly enough, Tucker Carlson has become one of the voices of reason, the very few people asking questions about Cold War II, even in mild terms, which I never expected of him. So good for him. But on the program, Professor Cohen said that essentially what Putin probably said to Tillerson behind closed doors when the two men face to face in Moscow. And again, by the way, Putin was not expected to meet Tillerson initially, but the Russians seem to have changed their minds about it. Was that, basically asking Rex Tillerson, his old friend who received the Order of Friendship Medal from the Russian Federation, what the heck's going on in Washington, Rex? I mean, who's really in charge?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And is there anybody we can constructively negotiate with and keep a deal with? I think is the entire subtext of what Lavrov was saying. And of course, the showdown between the Russian envoy to the UN, the successor to Vitaly Churkin, who died of that heart attack, quote unquote, or poisoning several weeks ago, and the UK envoy to the UN, where he said, look at me when I talk to you and stop insulting the Russian Federation. Of course, that was what made all the headlines, but the most, I think, incendiary accusation the Russian envoy made at his UK counterpart was when he accused the British government of sponsoring jihadists who are killing Christians in Syria. That part was not emphasized as much in the press coverage, but considering that, this is the Holy Week and we're having this conversation on Holy Friday when a lot of Syrian and Lebanese Christians are, gathering in the shadow of terrorist threats, very real and tragic terrorist threats that we saw last week in Palm Sunday in Egypt. It's a very, it's clear that the Russians to whom they were appealing to in this kind of rhetoric, that they're the defenders of Christendom now, and the UK has supported, the jihadis.
Yeah. What do you say about that, London Paul?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it was also quite telling that, we had the press conference between Lavrov and Tillerson. I mean, at times Lavrov was just humiliating him. Was tearing him to pieces in a very kind of polite way. But Tillerson was coming out with comments to do with, well, we have the evidence that proves, Assad was responsible.
What did you think? Didn't Tillerson? Didn't he field a question from Andrea Mitchell of NBC News? And again, not to make this all about personalities, but she happens to be Alan Greenspan, the former Fed chairman's wife. And he said something about her manners, or maybe that was a different journalist.
Yeah, that might have been. Yeah, and then there was the issue, and this was the irony is that they kind of sit down and I think they shouted. I can't remember, but someone obviously shouted this question out, and Lavrov goes, "Where's your manners?" And then, just completely ironic, because that's the kind of dry sense of humor Lavrov has got. Suddenly comes out and goes, "Well, you can shout now," and she proceeds to shout exactly the same way, without realizing he wasn't exactly telling her to shout. And it was this kind of public vitriol directed at the journalist. There was one journalist, I can't remember who it was, who said, Mr. Lavrov, can you answer in English? And he probably answered in Russian. I mean, it shows the disdain. And yes. I think I don't want to make a big point of this, but, V made the point at the start of the thing about all this 4D chess that's going on with Trump and Putin all playing this gigantic game. That is absolutely not the case.
Exactly. No, I think the Russians are genuinely getting fed up and just tired of what my friend the Saker, Andrei Raevsky, calls the unnegotiability of the Americans. I mean, for lack of it's not a term you can easily translate, but essentially what it means is that even if you think you have an agreement, it's basically worthless. You cannot trust the Americans to stick with any agreement.
It's complete, total unreliability. That is what we're showing to the world. Complete, total unreliability, and that's the only thing that we're reliable for, Paul.
Very sadly, it's true, and I think when obviously the Trump administration was elected, the Russians sat there and go, well, okay, maybe we might see some change, and there's a lot of the right noises coming out, but Syria was the moment when the Russians went, I just don't believe this. I mean, they were exasperated, they were furious, they are not happy with what's going on. If anyone thinks this is some plan to throw the neocons off, kind of off sync as to what's going on. It's just not the case. It sounds very wonderful, but the stories that kind of support this are so convoluted. The reality is, unfortunately, the US has backed itself into this corner. And I do think it really ultimately comes down to the fact economically they've kicked the can down the road. There's nowhere left. The road's run out. There's no cans to kick down. They've had it. And that is why we're seeing this kind of preemptive kind of measure where they went into Syria. There was the thing in Afghanistan, as we said. And now, not exactly sure what they're proposing to do in North Korea, but it's just this kind of faux show of strength. And the reality is the Russians have already told, the Americans know this. I don't know whether they believe it, but I think they're starting to believe it. The Russian military technology is so far ahead of anything the US have got. So if the US, want to start a war, they're never going to win it. So it's absolutely.
I don't think they think that they're going to win a war with Russia. I think what they imagine, based on what I've read from Evelyn Farkas and Fiona Hill, who was one of these neocon State Department holdovers that has unfortunately been brought into the Trump administration after they initially, fired Tolia Nuland, although her term was up, but essentially they told her.
What did those two people say, James?
Well, what they said is that they were pushing these documents through the Brookings, I think it was Brookings Institute, which is the same think tank that put out that notorious study, I think it was in 2007 or 2008, Which Path to Persia? How do we achieve regime change in Iran? And what they said is, well, we can do what they tried to do with the Al-Shairat strike. We can just target Syrian units, just selectively wear them down, bomb Syrian forces. As long as we try to tell the Russians to get out of the way, they'll back down because the Russians won't actually fight for Syria. That's the calculation. So therefore, whether they have technology or not, which of course these people obviously aren't aware of or don't care about, is irrelevant because we can always just bully Putin into backing down. And I saw it all over the social networks. Unfortunately, I saw it on sites that, were very pro-Trump that I used to read and have a lot of respect for, but I just don't. It's hard to take seriously now at this point because they're all
it's a complete joke at this point.
And I don't want to name too many specifics of them, but Conservative Treehouse is one of them, where they're like, oh, we got Putin to back down, and look at how the Chinese didn't veto the Security Council resolution that the Russians were left alone to veto.
Yeah, they think
matters.
This is winning. They think this is winning. Paul, what do you say about that?
It's nonsense.
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, the fact China just kind of didn't veto, it's irrelevant. I mean, it makes no, but I think the problem is there was an element within the US as well that's got rather frightened. I mean, it's a bit too little too late, though, just how close the ties are between Russia and China. There's a desire to try and split them up. It's not going to work. And I think it comes down to just brass tacks. They thought they could go and flex their muscles in Syria. It won't work. So they've gone, okay. I mean, noticed Iran's fallen off the microscope completely. No one talks about it. So now it's, okay, where else is there a major flashpoint? Oh, North Korea. Let's head there. It's just absolute nonsense. And all it's doing is, I mean, I said this the other day, Trump says he puts America first. Well, all he's doing is putting America last. He's doing them no favors on the international stage. And ultimately...
But it's 5D chess, Paul. It's 5D chess. Continue.
Yeah. I mean, and also, we'll support Trump when he was doing things, but if you look in the first 80 odd days of his administration, he's done absolutely nothing in reality. He promised a lot to do with economic reform. We've seen nothing. He said, I'm going to get a plan for destroying ISIS in the Middle East. We've not seen anything. Yeah, they just say, we're going to destroy them, but where's the plan? I mean, Russia said to them, sure, the plan will work with you, but we're not going to work with you until you show the plans what you intend doing. Then we can support, nothing. So it's all just, it's turned into a...
So what we have, Paul, is we have all these rumors of equipment being built up in Jordan on the southeastern border of Syria, ready to go in up the Euphrates Valley. We have all these leaks about, I'm sure you saw that this independent journalist, Mike Cernovich, had a report about how H.R. McMaster, the national security advisor who replaced General Flynn, is pushing for up to 150,000 ground troops in Syria, which frankly, I don't even think that number is logistically possible.
No.
Without, massive logistics buildup in Jordan and Turkey. And I mean, remember how big of a blow it was to the U.S. invasion plan of Iraq in 2003 when the Turks said, no, we're not going to let you invade from the north through the Kurdish areas.
James, you're fading really bad.
Hold on.
Okay. Hey, real quick, James, before you jump into the 03 Iraq thing, regarding, I think it's important to talk a little bit around who is specifically influencing McMaster's.
Hey,
and
Paul,
there's a recent...
Go ahead, CJ.
There's a recent article out on Zero Hedge, and this came from Disobedient Media in regards to McMaster's ties to George Soros-linked think tank. This is very concerning, in particular, because when you dig a little bit further into this think tank, not only did it receive funding from George Soros, but it also received $25 million funding from the Rouhani royal family as well.
So how much? The money might as well have come from Saudi Arabia, because the government of Bahrain is a Sunni regime that rules over a Shiite majority in that country, where the U.S. Persian Gulf Squadron is based, and of course. They've had revolts, they've had mass protests, they've blamed Iran for all of them. But the fact is that, it's very disturbing. And I believe actually another piece about McMaster that I wanted to mention on this program was featured on one of the blogs I read regularly, Turco Polier, which is published by retired Defense Intelligence Agency analyst and former defense attaché in the Middle East, including in Yemen, named Pat Lang, Colonel Pat Lang, and he published a piece about McMaster and some of the things, his studies, so-called studies, of how to fight the Russians on their doorstep in the Baltics or in Ukraine, and it's very
lunacy.
Yeah, it's really Fantasyland stuff. When you consider the logistics involved and the fact that how the Russians basically chewed up what at that time during World War II was the largest and most powerful army in the world and destroyed it and the masses of troops that still weren't able to achieve a conventional victory over the Russians. And of course, now, given the military technology gap that London Paul has talked about, as well as, of course, just simple fact of tactical nuclear weapons, I mean, it's complete nonsense.
Yeah.
Stuff that McMaster was putting out. It wasn't entirely false. It was just based largely on this fantasy that Russia has nothing better to do than simply invade the Baltics for the hell of it.
Yep. Paul, what say you?
Good. Yep.
Yeah, well, it's a bit like what the whole premise for Ukraine. They thought they'd drag Russia into some ground war, and of course, the Russia telegraphed it probably 18 months before it happened, and just said, "We're not going to fall for that. Yeah, we'll de-dollarize."
Well, the joke in Russia is they want to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. Basically, that's the
yes.
the grim humor of it. But they didn't.
Yeah, well, it is grim humor, but it's very true, and this is exactly the kind of problem that the West repeatedly. I mean, in fact, not just the way, moreover, nearly the whole world just fails to understand the Russian-Chinese mentality. They look at everything through the eyes of the West. They think that Russia's going to react the way that the US or the UK would react to a situation. The same with the Chinese, and they simply are not going to fall for it. They are not going to get themselves dragged into these kind of conflict. I think the real blessing that may come out of North Korea is that Russia's probably the nation more than anyone who can prevent this escalating. And people may argue and disagree. I really think they're the ones at the moment who have the potential to actually stop this escalating. And actually
how so can the Russians stop escalation in North Korea? Because I understand how they could stop escalation in Syria pretty fast, and it involves doing exactly what they did in October of 1962, when their forces were thousands of miles from home, a lot further away from home than they are now, in fact, and they put tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba. And you remember that General Salme and Kennedy's generals all wanted to go in, with a very hard and fast strike and take out all the Soviets. But Kennedy said, no, they've got tactical nukes ready to go off. We can't do that. We don't need nukes going off 90 miles from Miami, or to take the risk that at least some of the missiles might get launched before we can destroy them, and with a 7 or 8 minute flight time to New Orleans and Washington, D.C. So, one way they could stop the escalation and the piecemeal strategy in Syria is simply to make it clear that, they've got nukes on the ships in the Eastern Med. They don't even have to put them on land at Khmeimim. They can just make it obvious that, there is a limit. That is a risk if you directly attack Russian forces in Syria, is that, you could get tactically nuked. Not that they Russians would have any intention of doing that, but simply as another powerful psychological block to this piecemeal strategy. And by the way, I also think another reason the piecemeal strategy is going to fail is that the U.S. has no plan to deal with the Syrian army troops in Deir ez-Zor, even if they come up the Euphrates Valley from Jordan or wherever with this supposed Arab force of Saudi or Jordanian troops or whatnot. Well, first of all, the Jordanians aren't going to fight the Syrian Arab army and take heavy casualties. I know I had a friend and neighbor who lived in Syria in the early 1980s, who was from Texas, and he told me, when he passed through a checkpoint from the Syrian army to the Jordanian army, this was in the early 80s, there were supposedly hostilities in the air, and he said, "We're not going to fight each other. We're cousins. We drink tea together." So that's number one, nonsense. Number two, the Saudi army. We kept hearing all this nonsense about the Saudis have this huge force ready to invade Syria. It's complete idiocy. This army that can't even defeat, cot-chewing Zaidi Shia tribesmen of the Houthis, or I'm probably mispronouncing it, V. But they're going to take on Hezbollah and the Syrian army? It's nonsense.
No. If the Saudis went in, they'd be routed within a couple of days.
Right, and the U.S., the Pentagon knows that. At least any competent Marines who are adjutants to Mattis know that the problems that the Saudis have been having in Yemen and the defeats they've been suffering. So Deir ez-Zor is like a bone in the throat of this plan right now.
Right. So Paul, let me ask you this. Okay, what do you think the Russians can possibly do to de-escalate the situation in the Korean Peninsula?
Okay, well, I think first off, the recent meeting between Tillerson and Lavrov, from a US perspective, has completely refocused the US's perspective on global affairs. I think that for me was probably the main. I suspect Tillerson got on the plane and had his long flight home, chewing over what exactly the reality is, and pretty much I wouldn't even be surprised if he's reconsidering whether he even wants to stay on in the role he is. I think that's how serious the Russians
Yeah, he didn't even
presented.
want the job to begin with.
No, he didn't want the job, and I think given the first opportunity, he might jump ship. I'm not saying he will, but it wouldn't surprise me if he leaves. I think so. From a US perspective, they have that sphere of influence. They certainly have a sphere of influence with the Chinese. We know, also with the Japanese. There's definitely been there are some issues to do with the corals, etc., but by and large, there's been a big improvement between Russia and Japanese relations. I mean, yeah, the big fly in the ointment clearly is North Korea. Yeah, there is the political vacuum in South Korea. I mean, the question is, ultimately, is this just all hot air rhetoric from North Korea? I wouldn't say for definite, and there's certain indications that currently this weekend that there is a fear from the Chinese as well as what the North Koreans are evacuating residents. Something may happen. Now, the question is, what exactly does North Korea do, and is it something that the Russians can prevent? Yeah, if they launch some tactical weapon, then no, the Russians can't talk them around. I don't know what the diplomatic channels are like between Russia and North Korea. It might be better than we imagine. But I think if there's anyone who offers any hope, and I'm not saying the Russians will succeed, of course, but I think if anyone has got any potential to kind of put some glue between all the nations and get some common sense in this situation, they're the one nation who's capable of doing it. But I kind of get the feeling the US, Tillerson went home with his tail between his legs, and then maybe the US is going to have a very different attitude.
London Paul, let me ask you about one of the worst case scenarios that's been bothering me and on my mind lately, and that is, are we seeing, with all this troop buildup and equipment buildup in Jordan and the amount of armor that has been repainted in desert camo, some of it did get repainted in forest green cover and end up in Poland and Romania and the Baltics, but a lot of it went on to the Middle East, to Aqaba and to other ports on these rolls that came across the Atlantic that the Twitter feed already happened in particular has been following closely. Do you think that the cabal is capable of launching not just false flag chemical attacks on Syrian civilians, which we've already seen times, trying to use that as a pretext for the strikes in the Syrian forces by the U.S.? Do you think they're capable of going to the next level and actually staging a false flag chemical attack on American troops to blame on Assad?
That's a good question.
Is that ultimately their plan, to force Trump's hand? Because we see Trump making statements to the New York Post and General Mattis, Defense Secretary Mattis, saying, well, we're not going to target the regime necessarily as long as they don't use chemical weapons again. We don't have the intention of pouring troops in. Trump said, we're not getting, I forget the exact quote. He said something like, we're not going into Syria. Of course, we're already in Syria. But what I think he was trying to say is, we're not going to Damascus, is I think what he was trying to say. But isn't that the ultimate Hail Mary pass for the cabal, for the hardcore neocon fanatics?
Oh, most definitely. And you only have to look at, and Putin very cleverly said, what we anticipate, we've had intelligence, which of course is true, that we suspect there'll be other chemical attacks launched on the basis of blaming Assad. So he's kind of heading that off to some extent and saying that's a reality. But you're absolutely right. Are they capable of pulling off? Well, yeah, they can pull it off. Will the world tolerate it and stand it? Well, the Western world is just gobbling up this propaganda. So yeah, that's not going to be a problem. But I think it just comes down to the fact now is that the Tillerson-Lavrov meeting, and Putin for that matter, let's not avoid mentioning that aspect. That meeting may well have changed the whole focus of the US in terms of its global foreign policy. I mean, that could be blown out of the water that the US launches a preemptive strike. I don't think it will in the Korean Peninsula. But I have a feeling that Tillerson went home and went, hang on a minute, we're going to have to completely reassess what we do.
And we also saw that tweet of Trump's where he said it'll all work out in the end. The U.S. and Russia will make peace, basically something along those lines. And I wondered if that was the old Trump that the neocons had body snatched somehow had come back, had taken control of his Twitter feed.
Well, yeah, absolutely. So I do think this is the critical aspect, and we talked. I mean, I talked about it the other day where I said that Ukraine was kind of the sucker punch for the cabal, and I said Syria will probably be the knockout blow, and I do think in the fullness of time that will happen. I mean, the question is, yeah, okay, arguably they could launch that a kind of full-on, assault in Syria, but once again, they're going to start. How far do they spread themselves thin around the world?
I think you're absolutely right about that. I mean, back in the 1990s, they had those things called the quadrennial defense reviews, where I think it was QDRs, where the Pentagon would evaluate how it could fight two major theater wars on opposite ends of the planet. And of course, the typical scenario was, fighting another war with Iraq when Saddam Hussein was still in power, or some sort of campaign against Iran, and also, repelling a North Korean invasion of South Korea. And what came back by the mid-2000s, obviously after Iraq, was that the U.S. military was too spread thin and too worn out to be able to stage two major theater conflicts. And obviously, if you're going to take on the Syrian military and Hezbollah, and not just these ISIS guys who might get persuaded or bribed to melt away, that is a major theater conflict. And again, I just don't see the capacity to do it. To do both.
No, I'd agree.
They have to choose one or the other.
Yeah, and then of course you've got to throw Iran into the equation as well if it becomes a full-on US coalition assault in Syria. So no, I just don't think. I mean, the question is ultimately, does the US military have the stomach? I mean, they can puff their chests out, and not all the US military, but the US or Washington can have all this bravado, but ultimately, when it comes to the crunch, North Korea might be the example where we'll see that. But the big fear is, I mean, we know with North Korea is how they're going to respond. I mean, yeah, they're going to launch something this weekend. They always do. It's the anniversary of the founder, as we said. The question is, what are they going to do? And will the US see that as a pretext to go, well, that's an act of provocation, we're going to respond? And this is where the Russians come into play. They must have had this conversation with the US and said, look, this is the reality of what's going to go on. If you do X, Y, and Z in the Korean Peninsula, you do realize what the consequence is going to be. And I just don't think in reality that the US, well, I hope it's the case, but you can never be certain. I just don't think they're going to have a stomach to start a major, and it would be an absolute major conflict.
And supporting
in the
that
Korean
argument,
Peninsula.
London Paul, just on the optimistic glasses half full side, I think, these leaks we're seeing to Cernovich and to another, a former US Navy serviceman who writes for the rebel media. I can't pronounce his last name right now. Jack Pobosiek or Pobosiek?
Yeah, Paul Busk, something like that, right?
Yeah. Who was talking? He was doing an interview with Paul Joseph Watson, and they were saying, "Is this really going to happen? Are we going to launch a strike in North Korea?" And et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of dissension. It's clear that some people have the knives out for McMaster and are not. Now that we're finding out about the Soros connections to him and to Jared Kushner.
Yeah.
Let's not forget about that.
Mhm.
And of course, even Jared Kushner's Chinese property connections. All of these things. It seems that there are some people in the Pentagon, or probably in the Defense Intelligence Agency bureaucracy, who knew General Flynn, who are pushing back on some of this stuff.
Yes, undoubtedly.
Were we really going to put 150?
Paul, let me ask you this, Paul.
This is fantasy land.
Yep. Paul, let me ask you this, Paul. Here's the deal. Here's what's going down. Let me just get this in here. Let me just elbow in here. We got all the shenanigans going on in the world. Okay, we're seeing the flip-flopping on a grand scale. Now, supposedly, and CJ, you brought this up, what's going on with this investigation on Susan Rice? And then I want to talk about the rising star in the administration, which is Gary Cohn. So, CJ, why don't you bring that up on Susan Rice real quick?
Yeah, well, just, real quick, and this is something that we've kind of been waiting for in terms of the investigation and what specifically is going to happen. So now, again, this is coming from one of the House Intelligence Committee members regarding Susan Rice, and the fact that they have been looking at information as far as who she unmasked, how deep it goes, and how many people were involved, and that this very well is going to lead into a full investigation by the House Intel Committee Oversight Committee. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, V.
And then also we have Gary Cohn, who is, Harley Schlanger said yesterday, this guy is a killer. When it comes to the dirtiest of dirty bankers, he is a former Goldman Sachs guy. So being that this is all said, and we're seeing how this is swirling around the nexus, actually its own nexus is forming between Cohn and Kushner and McMaster's and Mnuchin, and now he's flipped. I mean, we spoke about this yesterday. He's flipped on Yellen. He's flipped on the strong dollar. Now he wants a weaker dollar with low interest rates. Everything he's ran on, the guy's flipped on it in less than 24 hours. Paul, what do you think is happening with this administration? Do you think that it is a captured operation at this point? Can we safely assume that, Paul?
And London Paul, I have a follow-up question when you're done with that one.
Okay. Yeah, no, undoubtedly. The administration was hijacked. That's why I've said all along, just because this is happening, it's not like Trump was this wolf in sheep's clothing and he's just stripped the sheep's clothing off and said, hello, I'm the wolf. No, the administration was hijacked. I mean, the clear, obvious case was removing Flynn. I mean,
right, and that was the substance of my follow-up question.
Right.
London Paul,
go ahead. Let him finish, Paul. James, let him finish. Go ahead, Paul.
No, it's fine. It's fine. So yeah, that was the that set the alarm bells off for me. Yeah, we've had this complete flipping of Trump's attitude to just about everything, but it does ultimately come down to the fact he bought the bullshit basically to do with Syria. They appealed to his better nature and he fell for it and said, okay, yeah, let's launch an attack, because he fell for the whole. And I'm not saying because ironically, of course, children were killed in what happened in Syria. Ironically as well, they were killed by the missile attack, the Tomahawks that the US launched on Syria. So he kind of fell for that. That was the way of kind of just getting him. So he went, I'm going to have to launch an attack. It was just a very snap kind of way of putting pressure on him, making him buckle. There's no doubt Trump is not cabal, but he's being caught up where he's lost control of the machinery of Washington. Of that, there's absolutely no doubt. Now, can he wrestle control of the administration back? It's possible. If he has enough support, but he's got to start to realize within the inner circle who are his allies and who are his enemies. And currently, I don't think he realizes. There's a lot of consternation with Bannon going on in terms of, well, there's been huge apparently disagreements between Bannon and Kushner, for example. Well, there's no surprise there. And he's got to start to realize who his allies are. I think one of Kushner's biggest problems is he's totally out of his depth. He doesn't know, he can't do the job he's doing.
No.
He's not capable of doing it. And people will automatically, he has associations with people. I think the biggest problem is he really is so far out of his depth and he's making decisions, I think, that he thinks is right. But he's equally probably being influenced by people who are giving him advice that is completely inappropriate. It doesn't necessarily mean that any individual, and this is particularly nefarious themselves, it's how the whole apparatus of Washington works. And clearly, if you can dupe the president, you can dupe anybody. So I think, but yeah, without a doubt, they've hijacked the administration.
London Paul, last question I have for you of the day is of the show from me, from my end, is what do you think of this UK Guardian story that came out? And basically, we talked about GCHQ the last time you and I did the show together with CJ. And Judge Andrew Napolitano's allegation on Fox that GCHQ did in fact spy on Trump and on Trump Tower or on Trump's associates during the campaign and even after the campaign. What do you think of that UK Guardian story where they came out and basically said, well, yes, we did spy on some of Trump's associates, campaign members. They didn't mention Carter Page explicitly, but it was implied that Carter Page was one of the ones they spied on, although they didn't seem to limit themselves to saying we only wiretapped Carter Page and didn't mention the others. And they claimed that Polish, Estonian, Dutch, and of course British intelligence all had so-called concerns about Trump's people meeting with the Russians as far back as 2015 with so-called suspected Russian intelligence operatives or diplomats. And of course, this story also was accompanied by another story that came out in the tabloids in the Mail that Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, was accusing Trump of having secret debts owed to the Russians for whatever his properties and whatnot. So I wanted to get your take on how much of this pressure of Trump to knuckle under the cabal is coming from the City of London, is coming from MI6. And even, I mean, we can laugh at her all we want at how bat crap crazy she is, but Louise Mensch, I mean, somebody put her forward in the Murdoch media, certainly.
So I wanted to get your take on that.
Oh, there's no doubt there's huge influence coming from the UK, absolutely undoubtedly, to put pressure on, because of course at a certain level of the cabal and the UK and the US are joined at the hip. They don't agree on everything, but yeah, there's a concerted effort to put a lot of pressure on Trump. And in some ways, you can see in a way that Trump's justification in terms of what he's doing, he's almost trying to say, well, look, I'm doing all these things, and the Russians aren't happy. See, I'm not, in bed with the Russians. It's absolute rubbish. I mean, and it's a ridiculous kind of justification. But you can see, I think he really took this job on. He thought it was going to be easy. He's had a harsh lesson in how politics really works, how Washington Beltway works, and he's sat there going, this job is infinitely harder than I thought it was going to be. And yeah, he has been utterly compromised. And there's been undoubted pressure. I mean, getting rid of Flynn was the classic example, because Flynn would have been the one person who would have sat down and said, hang on a minute, regarding Syria, for example, it just isn't going to happen. There is no, of course, getting rid of Flynn was just a way of leveraging the position and being able to manipulate. But of course, that's exactly what the cabal will do. They have to manipulate Trump. They have to manipulate the people around him to influence his decision process. So therefore, he becomes more malleable to them. And of course, we don't know now who's feeding him stuff. So yeah, exactly as he said, on an economic sense, he's done a complete 180 and going, well, yes, I'm now supporting Yellen. Well, I mean, look at the comments he made about Yellen late last year. So there is this complete switch, but I don't think any of it is because he's just stripped away the edifice and we're now seeing the real Trump. Trump's being advised and Trump believes what he's being told. And until he actually sits up and wakes up to the reality and realizes what is actually going on, he's going to keep making these ridiculous mistakes. And in the process, he's deeply damaging the US domestically and internationally.
Here's my take on what's going to happen as we run down to the end of this program, gentlemen. This is what my take is. We've seen a lot of flip-flopping. We've seen a lot of dangerous, absolutely dangerous precedents take place. And I believe is this: if we, again, like CJ said earlier, Susan Rice now is supposedly in full investigations. If no heads roll, number one, that is a sign that we are being gamed at a very high level. Number two, if Gary Cohn, which I have a feeling, very bad feeling about this, that Gary Cohn will replace Steve Bannon. If that occurs, then you know that all bets are off, and this is an entirely captured operation. And I don't care how many times I got to hear from other alt media personalities that, V, you don't understand. This is 4D chess. This is 7D chess. This is 10D chess. When I'm looking at this, gentlemen, and all I'm seeing is one-dimensional connect four. It's that simple. It's that easy. I don't think there's something complicated about this, like what Harley Schleimer says, this whole thing in Syria, like it was some sort of a master plan put together by three leaders to make a U.S. leader look good and strong. That is insanity. It realms and teeters on the verge of fantasy, So that's what I'm thinking is going to be happening here. It's a disaster.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. You're absolutely correct. There isn't some grand plan. I mean, and this is the thing as well, which Trump has probably not even begun to realize, or maybe he has realized. The one advantage he had as a leader, he couldn't be, he was self-made. He couldn't be bought off. He couldn't be blackmailed. But what did he do? He went and launched an attack without congressional approval. That could come back and bite him in the future, because they've got something over him now where they can say, well, Donald, if you don't do this, remember, you didn't get congressional approval for this military strikes in Syria. Just keep that in mind. And this is the problem. This is what they do. They couldn't compromise him that way, but they're trying to compromise him another way. And you're absolutely right. If we start to see other heads roll, and Bannon's the obvious one, if his head rolls in totality, then there's big problems.
Right.
But ultimately, at the end of the day, as I've said, and I mean this, whatever happens to Trump, what's coming is going to happen. It's not going to change anything. Trump isn't the white flag that was going to save the United States and save the world or anything else. He was there to do, from my perspective, to do a job, which was to wreck the cabal. Okay, he doesn't at the moment. He's not succeeding in doing that. But ultimately, it won't change anything. What's going to happen is going to happen. We're going to have the big financial reset. The world's going to change. It's going to take a number of years to complete this. But that goal will still be achieved. The question is, though, is one thing taking the wrecking ball to the cabal. It's how much is the wrecking ball taken to the world in the process of doing this. And North Korea is one example. Syria is another example. Or we can just go on and on. This is where we need the cool heads in the world to say, we're not going to tolerate this. We're not going to have these kind of military escalation. I mean, Syria is a great example. I don't think it will happen in Syria. What happens in North Korea, we'll see. And I think the next couple of days or so will tell us an awful lot in that regard. But that's the challenge that Trump faces. And he has to wake up pretty quickly to the reality and realize who his real, allies are and who the enemies are, and then take appropriate action. And one way or the other, we'll either see the Bannons get fired, or we're going to see a huge amount of people removed who are the problem in the administration. If you get to the right people back on, then it's game on, and we're back with progress in terms of what the US needs to do. Is that going to happen? Well, we don't know. I mean, we can't say at this stage. If it doesn't, the consequences for the US are going to be hugely more difficult than if Trump had stayed in and promised to do the things he was going to do. But we don't have a crystal ball in that regard.
Correct.
And I'm not going to be optimistic one way or pessimistic the other. We just have to see what unfolds. But you're absolutely right. Let's see what happens with the administration in terms of who leaves and who stays, and what new faces come in, etc., because that will give us the biggest indication as to exactly really who is in control. And James made the point, he's absolutely correct. The one thing that the Russians at the moment is like, who the hell is running the Washington? I mean, in all seriousness, at least in the old days, they knew it was the cabal, knew who they're dealing with. At the moment, they don't know who they're dealing with. And that just makes things 20 times more difficult in terms of how to assess how you approach Washington. But the Russians made it, and Lavrov and Putin couldn't be any clearer to Tillerson the reality of what's going on, both in terms of international, in terms of what the CIA were actually doing in these nations. I think he now knows that. He knows militarily what the reality is. So he's going to have to go home and think long and hard about this. But how much influence does he have in terms of doing a 180 and doing all the things he said he'd do before the last few weeks when they've completely flip-flopped? That's what another thing we'll have to wait and see.
Right. One of the things I want to get clear to the infantile alt media and a lot of the mainstream media characters that just simply do not get it. Okay, this idea that President Xi Jinping was somehow cornered in a corner over U.S. policy in Syria, over Tomahawk cruise missiles and chocolate cake. You've got to be kidding me. Okay, you got to be kidding me. It's a disaster. Like what Paul said on Monday, there's a reason why Xi Jinping didn't do an after press, a press conference after the whole entire meeting. There is a specific reason for that. Let's see how things transpire. James, give out your closing comments, man.
Just wanted to say, wish everyone in this audience a blessed, great Friday, great and Holy Friday and Holy Saturday as we approach the Easter and Pascha for those who are Christians. So just wanted to give that greeting to everyone. I'm just in a more contemplative mood this weekend and just thinking about, how we can make ourselves, I think, just spiritually better prepared for what is to come.
Absolutely.
That's an extremely good point, James. And it's something that, it is, because it is going to be tough. What's going to happen, however it pans out. And so
because as you said, London Paul, as V said, we can't stop this collapse. I know V believed that maybe we had all hoped that Trump could buy us some time, and that was really the best, buy us some cushion. But it just doesn't seem like there's going to be any other way to stop all this idiocy than for it to really have a stop in a hard way economically.
Yeah, ahead,
absolutely. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. The oil tanker had to turn around very rapidly in the first 100 days. Well, we're nearly, I don't know, we're up 80 odd days now. We're nowhere near. There's not enough progress being made, and time has run out. And I think that is it. I don't think there's any maneuver to kick the can down the road. And let's watch the statements that come out regarding the debt ceiling. That will probably be another telling comment as we await for some official discussion about this, rather than the total media blackout and the administration blackout. It's like it's not an issue. It's like it just doesn't exist. Well, we know it very much does exist. I think that's a hugely indicative of the economic reality. Never mind all the economic stats that come out every day that shows the US, not just the US, but the rest of the Western world, is bankrupt. There's no way. It's over. and we can't pretend otherwise that there's any other reality to it.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. CJ, your closing thoughts, buddy.
Yeah, I think right now is not the time. I agree completely in regards to what you said with the entire alt media. Right now is not the time to get stuck in the narrative of who's wrong and who's right. And I'm seeing that way too much. I'm not sure why people fall into that belief system that they get more focused on being right than wrong. One thing that we all as Americans have to understand is that any type of military escalation is a lot different from the past of what it used to be. The next round of potential conflict, okay, is not going to be watching this conflict on TV and streaming and everything. It's potentially going to be looking at some things occurring here in the United States, and I think that's important.
We could see a North Korean missile land on Hawaii or Alaska.
I think that's important for every American to understand. I think it's also important for every American to understand that no one's escaping this financial collapse that's in front of us. Okay, it's going to affect everyone, regardless of race, regardless of political ideologies. So I completely agree with James said. Now's the time to get strong in faith. Now's the time to get to know your neighbors, ensuring that everyone's prepared for this. I'm not sure if anyone's ever been through a situation like that in terms of what it's like, but I remember specifically that a tornado went through and actually hit two different buildings, one of which I was in. And when you're in that situation, there's no phones, there's no electricity, there's no cell towers. Okay, so when you go to gas to grocery store, you cannot use any type of ATM or debit card. You cannot call family members to find out if they're okay, where they are. So again, have those plans in place. Start thinking about some things. Have a primary meeting spot. Have a second. Again, we could probably go on and on about that, but I'm gonna stop right there, V. But the other thing too, just a couple of programming notes. We posted an awesome interview on roguemoney.net exclusive with Jim Rogers last night. So if you haven't watched that yet, go check that out. It's an amazing interview with Jim. I also want to thank James and London Paul for joining us and your insights. So God bless you and your families, and thank you for that. And then also a special note, today at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Deb Bankster Slayer is going to be going live with Nick from Evolution Consulting on her channel on Slay the Bankster, so check that out. And then also 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today, we're going to be bringing the entire team of Rogue Money together, minus James, but he's here with us today. So make sure you dial in and check that out. But that's all I have to say, V.
Absolutely. All right, thank you, everyone.
My last closing comment is this: it's here's some real 5D chess, and I will surmise it with this one simple sentence: China cannot have a unified North Korea on U.S. or South Korean terms. That is suicide for China, because at that point, you are basically putting the U.S. on the doorstep of China. And with that, I'll close. Again, check us out later on. And also, guys, London Paul is SeriousReport.com. Go there, subscribe to his premium subscription service. It's $4.75 a month. The best, for less than the price of a cup of coffee. That is where you need to go to get the intel. With that being said, we are over and out. CJ, take it away.